Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Is it okay? Great. I'm going to talk about a project I did at the ski resort, kind of validating and looking at the accuracy of our avalanche forecasting at the ski area. And we, couldn't be more different than Montana. We're like a mountain, and then we look off the mountain, and there's the desert. So different snow climate, but same problems that we all have in forecasting. Just some context, like both in space and time of the area at Mount Rose. We're a small ski resort located on the east side of Lake Tahoe, and pretty substantial history of both snow science and snow study and weather study in this area. Also, like quite a significant avalanche history within our terrain. But things really changed in 2000, we got permission from the Forest Service to open up a very substantial area of steep and complex avalanche terrain called the Chutes. And what that did was not only kind of put the ski area on the map in terms of having actual legit avalanche terrain, but also kind of was the catalyst to developing much more of a professional forecasting program within the ski area. As you can see, we did some avalanche mitigation work prior to that with that old chairlift there, but this really turned it into a professional operation. During that same time, the last 20 years, we've also seen quite a bit of change within how we talk about avalanche hazard and avalanche forecasting as a community. I remember when I first started as a ski patroller, avalanche forecast, you had to call on a phone line to get your avalanche forecast, right? And now we're can get on an app on our phone. So all of that also happened at the same time as we were kind of figuring out our avalanche terrain. And a lot of really smart people kind of paved the way for the program that I inherited when I became the avalanche forecaster. Dallas Glass was one of our first forecasters, and we kind of opened up the Chutes, and Mike Ferrari, and then that was in 2005, and then in 2012, Andrew Henney, who's now at Park City, took over the forecasting program, and we started out with this thing. We're actually using the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, and we kind of had this public forecasting looking thing that we were putting on our little website for all of our patrollers to look at. So all things have evolved a lot over the last 20 years that we've opened this terrain. And all of that kind of begs the question, how are we doing, and where do we go to next as we continue to evolve, improve things, and grow? And I think this is a question we all face as forecasters and as evaluators of avalanche hazard, right? We all deal with the problem of feedback, right? We don't always get the best feedback in order to validate our forecasts, right? As public forecasters, sometimes that's challenged by what kind of observations we get. Maybe we're swaying public opinion by actually writing the forecast and keeping people out of terrain. Not that that's a bad thing. But at a ski area, right, we go out and we are testing our forecast continually because we're trying to open up ski area terrain. So we are getting pretty decent feedback on the validity of our forecast and how we're doing. The bigger problem, though, I think, is how are we tracking this over time? Because we often look at, our daily review and we see how do we do today, right? But are we recognizing trends in forecasting over, years, seasons, right? And careers, and trying to evolve and grow our forecasting program. So one of the objectives of this project was to actually find some kind of methods that we could use reliably and consistently to quantify the accuracy of our avalanche forecasting at the ski area. We also wanted to use those to find out where are we making mistakes in this process, right? Are there steps within the SEMA hazard evaluation process that we tend to make errors in, and then can we fix those processes and become more accurate? We also want to know, is this process really working for us? Are we adequately recognizing the big hazards to personnel and to infrastructure, right? This is obviously a substantial avalanche in this picture, right? And these are the kind of things that cause accidents, cause, patroller fatalities and injuries. And those are the things that we want to make sure we're not actually missing those. So our hazard assessment process, in 2019, we started with the InfoX International product and built out custom workflows within that software program. And this really allowed us an opportunity to utilize our data in a different way than we had before, because we can export all of our forecasting and operational data, all of our weather data and avalanche observations into CSV format, put that in an Excel spreadsheet, and manipulate and look at that data in different ways than we ever could before. And so our hazard evaluation process basically looks like something that probably all of you are familiar with, right? We do an AM forecast. We go out, we do avalanche mitigation work, make lots of observations of the snowpack. Somebody, poor person, has to do data entry. Everyone loves that. And then based on all those results, right, we put together a PM, nowcast, a description of what conditions we had out there during the day. And this is like a continual feedback loop right into the next day's AM forecast. One of the nice advantages of using the InfoX program is we're able to build out that AM process and the PM process, that we're utilizing that same data that flows through from one day to the next, and we're also able to download all that information in the same format, so it's easy to do side-by-side, apples-to-apples comparison of like what we forecast in the morning versus what we observed in the afternoon. So it makes everything like really clean and neat and simple, as opposed to like having to look back through paper records or like flipping back through like old, information on the server that's like stored in like all these crazy file directories. So simple, clean, like a lot better data storage than we've had in the past. But one challenge we met was like, how do we actually like quantify the accuracy of our avalanche forecasts? And so we kind of looked at a few different methods and did a little trial and error. And basically what we found, the simplest, most straightforward method was simply to compare our morning forecasts with our afternoon PM nowcasts. And we kind of cleaned up our data to just look at like the middle parts of each season between 21 and 24, and just like the part of the season we're actually like actively doing avalanche mitigation work and had terrain open. And it turned out for this comparison we used 238 AM forecasts, 118 nowcasts, and that's because we didn't do a nowcast every single day. Some days we didn't do any avalanche mitigation work, so we didn't have any nowcast that was different than the AM. And basically went through here, identified any differences in the avalanche problem type, sensitivity, and distribution. And what we found in that comparison was 10% of the time on our PM nowcasts, we changed the avalanche problem type. And that worked out to 4% of our total forecasts. As far as the sensitivity, on 30% of the PM nowcasts, we made a modification to that, and that was 13% of the total forecasts. And then much lower number for the actual avalanche problem distribution on the PM nowcasts versus the AM. When we broke this data down by avalanche problem type, we noticed some like interesting trends that storm slab problems, we were often removing those problems from the PM nowcast, whereas wind slab problems, we were very rarely, like in no instances did we remove that problem. Persistent slab, dry loose, wet loose, and cornice, sometimes we're removing those problems or adding those problems to the PM. But when the blue bars are the sensitivity, and we are very frequently modifying the sensitivity of both wind slab, storm slab, and less so with the other problems. So we thought that was interesting, like just a trend in terms of like how we're forecasting versus what we are actually seeing with those problems. We thought maybe there's some bias involved with like the same person often would do the PM nowcast who had written the morning forecast. So we tried this thing where we looked back at our control results from that day. And so we randomly pulled a bunch of days avalanche mitigation records and went back and like built out basically a PM nowcast like from that day based on the control results, and then compared that to our original AM forecast from that day. And this was kind of interesting, but it turned out to be like much less useful than just comparing the AM to the PM. Because what we found was the less reactive avalanche problems, those problems that were listed as stubborn or unreactive, right, were just like not captured because we weren't getting lots of results on those problems on those days that we were going to see. But we did find that there was a tendency to forecast additional problems, particularly storm slab again, that we weren't actually like seeing in the field when we went out and did avalanche mitigation work. We did notice when we did this comparison that problem sensitivity was changed on 50% of our new hazard assessments versus our old hazard assessments. So we found like slightly higher change, but also like similar changed that sensitivity rating was the problem. We also went back and reviewed days where we had either natural avalanche activity, where we had remote triggering, or where we had unintentional triggering occur. And we looked back at the original avalanche forecast from those days to see if those particular avalanche problems had been on the forecast and if they'd been like rated as reactive, or if we'd had high avalanche danger forecasts when we would expect to see these kind of activity. And what we found was like during big storm cycles, during the big atmospheric river events that we get in Tahoe, that we were 100% of the time predicting that we were going to get natural activity, remote triggering happening. However, we found quite a few instances where we were finding remote triggering or natural activity on persistent slab problems that had not been forecast during the day. Those problems were listed as, either possible or unlikely, and we were still like seeing maybe a snowcat remote trigger at a persistent slab avalanche on those days. So that was definitely like a concerning finding in our forecast, that like persistent slabs were still surprising us. So kind of what we drew from all of this was overall our morning afternoon process is reliable and is like meeting our operational objectives, and our forecasters are able to accurately predict avalanche problem type, distribution, and likelihood. However, we do have a tendency to forecast avalanche problems in the morning that we ultimately don't end up observing, particularly storm slab problems and sometimes persistent slab problems that were the most commonly overforecast. Problem sensitivity appears to be like the thing in our forecast that like is most often changed. And this is the like step in the process that we seem to struggle with the most. And we kind of had a like team discussion of this, and we're like, why is this? What's behind this problem? And some of our conclusions were like the temporal span of when we're forecasting for, because we usually issue a 24-hour forecast, may just not match up with when these problems are most reactive and when we're going out and actually doing avalanche mitigation work. So maybe it's not that we're not capturing the sensitivity of the problem correctly. Maybe it's just that like we don't do avalanche mitigation work at midnight when that storm slab problem is the most reactive, right? Or maybe our observations are just not capturing that because we're not seeing natural activity that happens in the middle of the night when we're actually out there on the hill. Another thing that we thought about a lot was we're very reliant on remote telemetry data, particularly for our wind sensors. We have a couple ridgetop wind sensors, and unfortunately, due to rime that we often get in our maritime snow climate, often we just don't have good data from those wind sensors. We don't have accurate wind direction. We don't have any sort of wind speeds. We're basically like coming in the morning and we're, calling our mountain operations people and we're asking them like, was it windy last night? What direction do you think it came from? Because we have no data. And I think we know from research that other folks have done that wind slab problems are particularly hard to predict and are very localized to specific terrain characteristics and that wind, how it overlays over that terrain. So I think because we're not getting good data, we're maybe not able to accurately forecast our wind slab problems because we just don't have enough information on wind speed. So we're kind of making stabs in the dark and very frequently getting that reactivity of the wind slab wrong. Kind of what all of this led us to is a conclusion that forecasting is hard. And this is actually a picture from the starting zone, Carl, that really kind of grabbed my attention, right? And there are so many different aspects that go into determining whether that avalanche problem is going to be reactive or not and what that snow stability is going to be. And there's a lot of cognitive effort that needs to go in to put all these pieces of the puzzle together in order to build an avalanche forecast. And that takes experience, not only with understanding weather and snowpack and the terrain, but also years of just personal experience of building forecasts and thinking about all of these things, right? And so naturally, we're going to have errors in our avalanche forecast, which I think we all know that, right? However, it's much easier to make good observations, right? This is a picture from some of my Pro 1 students recently up in Washington. And the conceptual model of avalanche hazard gives us this like really good structured framework for describing avalanche hazard when we're observing avalanches out in the field. And sensitivity, right? The description of how to describe sensitivity is pretty clear based on explosives triggers, natural triggers, right? However, as we've seen, this is hard for us to put together in advance when we're making a forecast, right? So I think that really feeds back to the importance of making that afternoon nowcast and really focusing on making a good description of what we've observed during the day, because this is our learning tool, is that afternoon nowcast, because this allows us to evaluate our forecast, figure out what happened, right? Think back, and then potentially error correct our processes. Something we talked about was just eliminating bias as well in this by having multiple individuals involved in this process. And so that flow of AM forecast, observations, PM nowcast, really in order for us to learn as forecasters and to grow, really needs to start with that PM description of conditions and flow into learning how to be more effective forecasters and more accurate forecasters. Another thing that we really appreciated was how easy it was once we had all of our information within the InfoX system to pull that data, download it into a spreadsheet and use that data in any way we wanted to, right? To manipulate it, to ask different research questions. And so I really think we've only scratched the surface of what we can do now that we've actually have 5 and now 6 years of operational data that's in a consistent place. It's all in swag format, right? All of our forecasts are made using the conceptual model. And so we have a pretty interesting data set that maybe we can look at future research questions with. And I know there's also lots of other operations out there that are now using InfoX platform or using SmartMount, which I think has a similar platform. That potentially as researchers we could start to look at bigger questions over larger data sets and multiple operations in multiple snow climates. I also think we've talked a lot about forecasting in a public forecasting context, right? But many of us know intuitively, because we've had experience as ski patrollers, that ski patrolling is a good way to learn about avalanches because we get to experience a lot of avalanches. And so ski areas that are making good observations and recording good data are a great source of information to understand how we as human beings are making decisions in the forecasting process and how accurate we actually are at predicting things, because we get a lot of feedback from our explosives mitigation work. I just want to talk about, right, obviously this is a small data set, right, and we don't have, even though we have a lot of data and a lot of feedback on our observations, we don't do avalanche mitigation work at night. There are plenty of days when the weather was too bad, we didn't go out and do avalanche mitigation work, so our data set is obviously not perfect, as any data set would be. We started out this project, we wanted to look at everything, including the hazard rating that we did, and we sort of got bogged down in how much work was actually involved in looking at all this data and crunching this data. And so we didn't look at avalanche size, we didn't look at how accurate we were at predicting aspect and elevation with defining our different avalanche problems. So there were quite a few things we didn't actually consider in this. And this is obviously a piece of terrain that we're forecasting for at the ski area, which is quite small and which we have a lot of experience with as practitioners, and we know its history and we kind of understand how the weather interacts and the snowpack interacts with that piece of terrain. And also a limited number of individuals over the years who are producing the forecast. I think there were 6 of us total who were writing forecasts over that 5-year period that we looked at. So in the future, we want to look at some things. We want to look at some correlations between snowpack tests and how our PWLs are actually reacting, especially during incremental loading, because we did identify that as a source of problems for our forecasting operation, that often we're just missing this activity that's happening on our PWLs. It's surprising us, and those are things that we don't want to get surprised by, because those are often pretty substantial avalanches that could injure people and could cause accidents. We also want to talk a little bit more about how our forecast confidence and uncertainty and our mindset is actually relating to our weather and our snowpack and our accuracy of our forecasts. So just have a little bit better and more nuanced discussion as an organization. And then I think this has sort of come up in some other talks, right, of hazard scales. And I think there's an interesting opportunity, especially with our data set that we want to explore in the future, of looking at how we as forecasters are actually applying our avalanche sensitivity, distribution, and size, and also avalanche problem type to different danger rating scales. And I put 2 scales up here, right? We're all familiar with the North American Public Danger Scale, but InfoX kind of put their own hazard rating scale up there because it's slightly more applicable to the forecasting within an operation as opposed to the public danger scale. And so I think it's interesting because there is, as we're just talking about, a little bit of bias in how people are applying this. And so I think it would be fascinating to look at how different organizations are actually applying their hazard rating to these scales to like maybe build a little more consistency as a community. And just wanted to say thanks to my co-authors on the study, Matt Zupan and Evan Leonard, also to Andrew Henney, who helped me out with a little bit of the history of Park City, Mike Ferrari, who's the risk manager at Mount Rose and the whole ski patrol there, and also to Ari, who helped me out to give this presentation at Tromso. And that's my very cute dog, who is much more popular than me at the ski area. Thank you. Yes.
I might have missed it, but in terms of the sensitivity, was that specifically associated with like certain avalanche problems more than other avalanche problems? Was it storm slabs and wind slabs, or was it?
Yes. Let me see if I can find that one. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so, right, and sorry, that slide's super not clear. So sensitivity, we changed it most often on wind slab. That's a little misleading because we also forecast wind slab the most often because we are a very windy place at Mount Rose. But yeah, that's most frequently modified sensitivity, followed by storm slab and persistent slab. I tried putting the graph with the total numbers of those problem types on there, and it just became too chaotic. But I do think it's interesting that we don't ever remove wind slab off the problem list, but we're very frequently modifying the sensitivity of it. So I think we have trouble gauging what our wind slabs are actually going to be like just based on our remote telemetry data and whatever other information we're getting in the morning.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense just because when these storms come in, it's really hard to figure out if you're going to get that little change in density or not get that change in density that might create your weakness for those things. So it's going to be a tough one, especially since you're always applying your mitigation at a certain time.
Yeah.
Because you might hit the forecast just right in terms of we think we're going to have a lot of wind slabs, but you didn't have a lot of wind slabs because you missed your window by an hour or 2 or something.
Right, yeah, and I'm not actually sure that we're bad at gauging the sensitivity. We may just be unable to match up those 2 time scales of when the problem is most reactive in nature and when we're able to make observations. And I think we all face that challenge, right? Because I mean, even you're looking at public forecasts, right? People are generally not going out at night, and sometimes things are happening at night, and so you're not getting information. You're going back and trying to look at, old avalanche debris and figure out what actually happened to see if that problem was actually reactive. So, yeah, it's just kind of a question mark. I mean, we've talked about doing some different things, like trying to make our forecast scale a little different rather than trying to do a 24-hour forecast. But we also have people out on the hill like groomers and lift mechanics who are out there at weird hours in the night. So it doesn't really make sense to cut that piece of time out of our, forecasting efforts, because then we're sort of ignoring the hazard to those people who are out at nighttime. So. Yes.
Were you over forecasting the sensitivity or under forecasting the sensitivity, or both?
Both, yeah. It was almost 50-50. And I don't think we quite had enough. The storm slab, I think it was mostly over forecasting. I didn't feel like I had enough we had enough data in the data set to like make a good judgment on it. But in terms of like overall sensitivity changes versus from like morning to PM, it was almost 50-50 into over-under forecasting. Yeah. But I mean, obviously it's important because you all know, like if you walk through that conceptual model process, right, that's a pretty early step in the process that determines your likelihood, and then that's gonna change your overall hazard rating. So that like the earlier you make that change in the process, the more influence it has on the output. And originally I didn't even want to look at the sensitivity and distribution, but once we started like pulling the data, we realized that like distribution was almost never getting changed and sensitivity was getting tweaked with all the time once we got results, and which also somewhat makes sense a ski area because we have a pretty like finite set of terrain, and we kind of, I think, understand the distribution of our problems within our terrain probably like really well, and then our, variable is our weather and how that weather interacts with the terrain. So I think it makes sense that sensitivity is the factor that we have to struggle with. Yeah.
How much, in terms of your operation, does like nailing sensitivity change your plan or your actual operation? Like, is it a big deal? This is what I'm wondering.
Yeah. I mean, we tend to err on the side of conservatism and like go out there every day knowing that we may need to do like all of the mitigation work. And then once we get some feedback that we realize that, hey, maybe this problem is not reacting, or maybe this problem isn't going as big as we expected, or it's propagating really widely and, 3 shots clean out the entire area, right? Then we adapt to it. So it doesn't necessarily change our AM plan, because I think we always like go out full bore, except when we know that like maybe we only got 6 inches of snow and we know everything's going to be small, right? And then we'll scale it back. But yeah, it's not a giant issue, and that's why I think like we feel pretty good about what we're doing. But I do think it like matters in terms of like the big picture of how do we get better. Yeah. Yeah.
Is the sensitivity in the storm, wind slabs and whatnot, how much is the interface being compacted by skiers or open the previous day? Mm-hmm. Is that contributing to your misses in sensitivity?
I don't think it's contributing to our misses. It's definitely a factor that we think about, right? And it's definitely a factor we think about within our avalanche terrain, is like how much have we had it open recently? And so is there a bad interface? Like if we were able to have it open the day before, we know there's probably no surface hoar that built up. But if we had a rain crust form and then all of a sudden we've had a day where we can't open certain terrain because it was slide for life conditions, and then if we have a clear night, we're thinking like, did I get surface hoar on top of a rain crust? Yeah, things like that, right? Or just surface faceting. If the surface hasn't been like disrupted heavily, that will definitely impact things. But yeah, I think it's a factor we consider, but I don't think it's what's impacting that. Yeah. Yeah.
After the study, was there any major operational changes that came from it internally? After looking at this, I know you said you do PM nowcasts every single day. Are you doing that now?
We're still not doing them every single day just because it's an operational challenge in terms of like having enough people to do it, especially since I hurt myself in December, so I have like been up at the mountain very little. But yeah, we've been more diligent about it. It's kind of become a thing that like every day we do mitigation work, we're going to make sure that we do a PM nowcast. We had been trying to do that for the past like 3 years, and we just like weren't quite getting there. So I think this was like a good impetus to like make that more of our standard practice. We've also like, we had always built into our workflow where we enter all of our avalanche observations, and then that like quality controlling and checking all of that data entry is part of like going through that PM nowcast like workflow anyway for someone on the snow safety and forecasting team. So we had been doing that, but we hadn't been like quite as consistent at like trying to get everything done consistently by the end of the day. And this has like helped like give us the boost that we need to be more diligent about that. Yeah.
Is upper management on board with this? Can they look at infolex and what ski resorts like the SEMA, one thing you're missing is external pressure, like opening. You know, do you share this with the people that are pushing to get it open?
We're really lucky that we, for the most part, have support for management to do whatever we need to do. I feel really lucky working at Rose because we've had a long history of people within the ski patrol and within the snow safety team being like really involved with avalanche education. Like our risk manager now, Mike Ferrari, is heavily involved with National Avalanche School, and so like he supports like doing industry best practices and actually like going through these processes and not cutting corners just to open terrain. So I feel like very fortunate that we have that ability, and also that we're like a small family-owned place where we're not getting this like big corporate pressure. Like I think most of our pressure to open terrain is like an internal pressure as well of like, you know, we're skiing around all day and guests are like, when's it gonna open? When's it gonna end? Like you like start to feel this like pressure, and like it's really hard to like short circuit that and try to not like rush things. But yeah, I think we mostly have management support for this. Cool. Any other questions? Thanks.